Hello, everyone. Welcome into the Guilty as Charged podcast here on Bolt Breakdowns. As always, talking about the latest Chargers news, talking points, and whatever's going on in Charger land. And this week, the biggest event, I guess, that Steven and Tyler already talked about on the podcast. I made a YouTube short about it, but it was Austin Ekeler making a contract adjustment with incentives to return to the Chargers. So I wanted to talk about this, I guess, from what happens in the immediate, what happens with the offense this year. What will it be like for Ekeler in terms of trying to hit those numbers? And then what the future, I guess, of this team holds. Because as Schefter and other people have said, as Ekeler has said himself, Ekeler's goal is to set himself up for free agency next year. And the Chargers, more or less, are going to be $60 million over the cap. So if Ekeler does ball out again and he gets 20 or so touchdowns, he hits his yards marks this year, he's not coming back to the Chargers, right? Some team probably will not, even if they don't give him a multi-year contract, give him something that's a little bit more upfront with the money in years 1 and 2, and then probably maybe overpay for a year or two of Ekeler, even if they're not going to give him a long-term deal, just based on that production alone, right? But teams just weren't in a position to trade capital for him and then extend him in terms of Ekeler's trade request this time around. But more or less, I do think you can kind of talk about this, and we'll talk about some, buts to this later when I get to sort of, theorizing what the Chargers' future past Ekeler is. Is Ekeler still in the Chargers' future plans? Is there a path where he could be a little bit later in the show? But more or less, I guess we should just get right into it and start with the incentives and everything that is kind of going to happen this season, right? So I did make this little slideshow presentation, the present and future of Austin Ekeler and the Chargers running game. So if you did miss the incentives, because I don't remember if it came out before Steven and Tyler recorded their podcast, but essentially this is how it plays out. He gets up to $1 million for total yards. That shouldn't be too difficult a mark for him to hit, but I'll get back to that in a second. He's averaged, 19 touchdowns in the last 2 years. So his high mark that he has to hit for that $600K incentive is 16. Seems reasonable, right? Even if he's on the lower end, he would still get something. Gets up to $150K for the Pro Bowl. And as Tom Pelissero says in his tweet, he had 1,600 yards last year, 18 touchdowns. A similar season can get you that full $1.75 million, depending on if you make the Pro Bowl. And I still would not guess that Ekeler is really a Pro Bowl candidate. I just think we've seen in the Pro Bowl voting the last couple of years, Ekeler, they really put a premium on that Josh Jacobs, Nick Chubb, any other guy who's been a Pro Bowl running back the last 3 years on that ground game production more specifically. And we know that Ekeler is going to do a little over half of his damage in the run game and then the rest as a receiving threat, right? So that's not something that quite aligns with what the Pro Bowl looks for in terms of like a ground and pound running back, a la Henry, Chubb, Jacobs, whoever you want to say. So in terms of these incentives, I do think this obviously Ekeler is going to be looking for every carry every time he wants to steal a goal line touchdown, right? That I do think is a good motivator. I actually did think when the Chargers announced, or when these incentives were announced, that they would be a little bit easier for Ekeler to attain, right? If you put the average Ekeler season from the last 3 years into this formula, then you would get these numbers. But the thing to remember is Ekeler is a running back who is going to be going on into his age 29 season, right? Has had very high usage rates the last number of years, hasn't had a RB2 to take some of the load off of him. Maybe that'll change this year. But when running backs just have had these successive seasons of 200 carries, 200 carries, 200 carries, and then Ekeler last year having 200 carries and 100 receptions, right? That does take a toll. Even if Ekeler's not necessarily being run into the ground, like, say, a Derrick Henry or formerly Ezekiel Elliott, right? That all does take a toll. And you wonder, especially when a running back, as they approach 30, even if with Ekeler in the shape he's in the condition he's in, you wonder when that catches up to him. And so that's the only thing that's kind of lingering in the back of my mind with these incentives. The other thing that is more in the forefront of my mind in terms of whether Ekeler can hit these incentives or not is, of course, the new offensive coordinator change, right? Ekeler played in a very Joe Lombardi very short average depth of target offense that favored Justin Herbert getting Ekeler the ball in space, right, making moves, and that's how he got, ultimately the numbers he's gotten in the air in the receiving game the last couple of years now. Kellen Moore comes in. So what is this offense kind of going to look like, especially as someone with Brandon Staley who has said he wants to throw this shit down the field, hasn't been able to, throw the shit down the field yet. Which, is an offense that if you're just talking about reaching the deep parts of the field more, that's something that would probably not favor Ekeler getting the receiving production that he has gotten in the last couple of years here, right? But there's obviously still going to be a big role for Ekeler to play as the RB1 in this offense, even if, say, the A dot does vary and change a little bit. In addition to Kellen Moore, this offensive line should be back and should be healthier, right? It'll be a little bit different. Matt Filer obviously gone after a season where, he kind of regressed, but the Chargers saved some money anyway. They're moving Salyer over to right guard. Zion Johnson plugged in at the left guard next to Rashawn Slater. So I would say run to the left side, please. Just do that a lot. But I do think that will be, what the Chargers run game is, fingers crossed that Rashawn Slater, of course, stays healthy, and that Corey Linsley stays healthy as well, right? That's what the Chargers really need to have a good running game. In addition to the offensive coordinator changes and how they call plays, you can, having a successful pass game, and as Staley says, marrying the pass and the run. This offensive line staying healthy is going to be a huge factor because it was just such a noticeable difference going from Slater to Salyer last year at left tackle, and then, Filer taking the step back he did. And then, of course, Zion Johnson, while good last year, was a rookie, right? So, Trey Pipkins took the step up, but still wasn't necessarily elite last year, right? So once those injuries started to hit and Corey Linsley missed a game or two, and then Slater obviously missed the whole year, I do think a lot of the run game component of this offensive line, the wins kind of got taken out of the sails there, so to speak. So all of those guys hopefully being back healthy in this new, reconfigured version of the offensive line from left to right, I do think will pay dividends for Kellen Moore and Austin Ekeler and the Chargers run game. And speaking of the Chargers run game from last year, in addition to just talking about the offensive line, a lot of this had to do with the play calling and how unstable this offense was. So I brought up this tweet from Derek Klassen, who charted the Chargers offense and charted Justin Herbert more specifically. And, there were just a lot of runs, if you watch the tape last year, where the Chargers would put themselves behind the chains pretty often on second down, third down, and then ask Justin Herbert, hey, can you bail us out on 3rd and 12? Can you bail us out on 2nd and 14? Whatever it might be. And so these are some of the stats from Derek. Looked into it because I was a little bit curious. The Chargers finished 26th in DVOA on first down runs and 28th in yards per attempt on 1st and 10. In turn, Herbert led the NFL with 114 2nd and 10 plus pass attempts. As he puts it, it's just an unsustainable way to run offense, right? The Justin Herberts and the Patrick Mahomes and the Aaron Rodgers of the world, they're going to bail you out of some of those situations, but they're not going to bail you out of 114 of them. And so that's ultimately what the problem with the Chargers offense was last year in terms of these first down runs that kind of like nuked what the Chargers were trying to do. And I think that's what also Staley talks about when he talks about marrying the run in the pass game, which is a lot of times it just felt like they were taking like, okay, here's our isolated run on first down. Then here's like the pass that's going to bail us out of what we just did, or try to make up for it, so to speak. But I think he does want those processes in the run and pass game to be a little bit simpatico. So the run sets up the pass, so to speak. So maybe you gain 3 or 4 yards on first down, have a positive play, and then, throw the ball, or you throw and then put yourself in a position to maybe run the ball on second down and pick up a 2nd and 1, a 3rd and 1, right? We can talk about all of these things, and it'll be interesting, I guess, to see how exactly Kellen Moore adjusts to this. And I'll get to Kellen Moore and talking about first down runs in a second here. This was the 2022 and 2021 pass rate leaders. So obviously the Chargers threw the ball the second most out of any team last year. It was Tampa Bay at number 1, the Chargers at 2, Minnesota 3, Jets 4, Cincinnati 5. But you saw that the Chargers were at about 65% in pass rate, meaning they ran the ball on 35% of their plays. The Cowboys, meanwhile, on this list, if you actually look at Kellen Moore's offense, are much lower. So that kind of, makes you wonder what happened. Of course, there was a section of the Cowboys season for anybody who watched, even a decent amount of Cowboys last year where Cooper Rush was put in as the starting quarterback. And I think that does affect some of these numbers in terms of why the Cowboys ran it a lot more than they had previously. As you see in their 2021 season, the Cowboys were a lot more of a balanced team. They had a pass rate of about 59.61%, so they were passing on about 60% of their plays, and then, just kind of running on about 40%. The Chargers were a little bit more balanced relative to their 2022 as well. They had about a 60-40 split too, instead of the 65-35 that they did in 2022. So I think that what you kind of want to see with the Kellen Moore offense in general is that the Chargers should probably not be in the top 3 of this statistic. Like, you do want them to run the ball a little bit more and a little bit more effectively in terms of marrying that pass in the run game than they just have been able to, right? But it's a lot of, again, Justin Herbert having to bail them out on second and third down at times where that becomes unsustainable. And unfortunately for the Chargers, for large portions of this season, Keenan Allen wasn't on the field. Mike Williams wasn't on the field. And so you're asking a lot of the football gods at that point for Justin Herbert to be able to bail you out on 3rd and 12 with, DeAndre Carter. So it's a little too much to ask of the football gods from play to play. But again, I think what you see from these pass to run rates, it just shows you that, like, it depends on your situation in terms of what the Cowboys were dealing with this year, what the Chargers were dealing with. But ultimately, I do think you kind of want to be more in the middle as a balanced team, like, say, Dallas was in 2021 with those pass run splits, if you will, considering the types of offenses both of these teams want to run. This is Dallas's pass frequency over expected, which is a point that I'm going to get to here. I guess talking about it now, the Cowboys ran the ball more. So you may have heard that Mike McCarthy doesn't like Kellen Moore because he wants to run the ball more. And so that was, establishing the run and some of the things that Dallas wants to do. Dallas actually has a significant amount of, running the ball on 1st and 10. Some of that was affected by Cooper Rush last year. But they ultimately ran the ball more and established the run when you talk about last season. So you can't separate that from talking about Kellen Moore's identity on offense. I think a lot of that was personnel based, right? In terms of, again, the loss of Dak for, 4 or 5 games last year. But even when Dak did come back, and that's a stat that I want to get to now, 52% of all the Cowboys' runs were on 1st down when Cooper Rush was in quarterback from weeks 2 to 6. And then with Dak at quarterback, 49% of the Cowboys' runs were all on 1st down. So not a whole lot changed, right? And you still had, again, the regression of Zeke playing into this, riding Tony Pollard a bit. But, they also had 8 total run attempts on 1st and 15 or 20 after holding penalties, right? So despite all the talk of, like, the Cowboys trying to change up their offense, right, to be more of a Mike McCarthy system as opposed to a Kellen Moore system, they ran the ball a lot last year, and I would argue, to some extent, ran the ball inefficiently, right, in terms of the amount of attempts that were coming on 1st down, right? Analytics, 538, whatever source you kind of want to go to says you sort of want to pass to be able to set up your run. Obviously, that changes from drive to drive and situation to situation, but you want to be throwing more on 1st down when your quarterback is Justin Herbert and when your quarterback is Dak Prescott than some of the bottom 10, bottom 15 guys around the league. Those are both 2 top 10 guys. So yeah, I already talked about the Cooper Rush, Dak Prescott thing, but you even see that this was something that was more embedded in the Cowboys offense than who the starting quarterback is. So that kind of brings us, I guess, to talking a little bit about the Chargers, right? The joke about Joe Lombardi was obviously the short average depth of target, and the infamous Brandon Staley quote from that locker room video or All In a couple of years ago, where he said, "We're going to throw this shit downfield." They didn't throw the shit downfield, as people know. as you see in this Kyle Yates tweet, 7.8 yards average depth of target in 2020, about 7 again in 2021, and then 6.9, if I'm reading that correctly, last year. If you look at the A-dot with Dak Prescott and Kellen Moore, it never fell below 8.2, and in 2022, Dak Prescott had an 8.7 yards average depth of target as well. So I do think ultimately when you talk about what Brandon Staley's identity wants to be on offense, like it is much closer to where Kellen Moore kind of was in Dallas, or what Kellen Moore's theory is in terms of throwing the ball downfield, right? And so when we go back to talking about Austin Ekeler a little bit, right, Austin Ekeler really benefited a lot from playing in the Joe Lombardi offense statistically, simply because like a lot of these were screens, dump offs that he would take and do wonders with, right? So that was a lot of what 2021 and 2022 was for Austin Ekeler, right? If you're having 8.79, potentially 10 yards of average depth of target on throws, then that probably is an offense that doesn't favor Austin Ekeler getting the ball in space quite as much, right? That's an offense that really favors Mike Williams and Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston, right? Kind of doing their thing in the open field. I would even say Gerald Everett in addition to that a little bit. So yeah, the question is how much is this offense going to favor Austin Ekeler in the receiving game? And in terms of hitting that total yards mark, I would actually say that the Kellen Moore offense, if it is to be run the way we expect it to, and in the way that Kellen Moore wants to run it without the voices upstairs telling him things in Dallas, I do think that ultimately, with the Chargers wide receivers coming back healthy as well, and Keenan Allen and Mike Williams hopefully playing more than they did in 2022, it ultimately would be a little bit more aggressive, and I would say a little less Ekeler favorable, right? The other question is, I think, what happens behind Ekeler, right? So Ekeler has publicly talked about the need for an RB2. He talked about it last offseason. Back in the 2021 season, Ekeler talked about, the need for a running back who can kind of support him. And, even kind of infamously said, I believe in November of 2021, somebody has to step up. This was before Isaiah Spiller was on the team, but when it was Joshua Kelly and Larry Roundtree and a lot of those guys in 2021. But the RB2 hasn't really progressed in a way without Ekeler. I do think Joshua Kelly had a good season last year, absolutely. Ended up having 287 yards, 70 carries, had about 100 yards receiving as well. But ultimately, you compare that to Joshua Kelly's rookie year, and those numbers are actually down in about a similar amount of games. He had 111 carries in his rookie year, and then had 69 carries last year, right? So there wasn't a whole lot of volume for Kelly, and I know he did miss some time, but even if you give Kelly those extra games, he's probably not getting anywhere close to 111. And a lot of the highs for Kelly last year were like 5 to 8 carries, right? So, it did his job as an RB2, but didn't really take the stress or supplement Ekeler in a way that I think the Chargers would want to do more positively. And then when it comes to Isaiah Spiller, he's the big question mark, I think, entering this season. And Derek Klassen even said this as a follow-up tweet, right? The Chargers didn't draft a running back, haven't really signed a running back. Maybe they will by training camp. But they're kind of betting on Isaiah Spiller as it currently stands to take the next step forward. And I do think that is a big bet to make, especially for a running back who in year one didn't show you a lot. And the Chargers coaching staff straight up did not trust Isaiah Spiller down the stretch. They favored playing Larry Roundtree over him for special teams, which is something we saw. In addition to that, we just didn't see the production, right? We saw him in a couple games mid-season, like the Falcons game and the Niners game, but ultimately had 18 carries for 41 yards and something like three receptions for 13, right? Like at the end of the day, yes, I do think Isaiah Spiller will end up more, in terms of total yards and attempts, and he'll get more volume in this offense simply after being, in the system for, another year. But now he has to learn a new system, is still 21 years old. How much does the coaching staff trust him, right? So I do think they expect him to take the next step and probably, eat into those like Kelly snaps. But I think the Chargers just as a whole need to get more out of their RB2, RB3 positions in order to kind of help Ekeler, right? They're going to ride him as much as they can, right, in terms of offense, but in terms of supplementing Ekeler, And this goes into the future version of like talking about what the Chargers are post Ekeler, if you will. You know, Isaiah Spiller or Joshua Kelly kind of needs to show something this year. And Joshua Kelly, I would say more, probably less so, because Joshua Kelly, along with Ekeler, is a free agent in 2024. So now you're talking about Spiller having 2 years left on his rookie contract after this year. This is kind of the year we need to see something from Spiller if both of those guys are potentially gone next year. And so I think that's, you know, what the Chargers coaching staff kind of is betting on. Whether that's a smart bet or not, we'll see. And I sort of just, you know, put this as a tweet after it was announced that Ekeler was coming back in terms of like, what's the succession plan? Where do we go from here? A multi-year extension probably is going to happen for Ekeler. The Chargers have already drawn their line in the sand as to where they see him going, right? Like, and I don't think there's a ton of like multi-year extension talk for Ekeler around the league, right? This is probably a problem with his trade request as a whole. The Chargers aren't going to be in a position to really franchise tag Ekeler, although I guess they could in theory, just because, again, of how expensive it is to franchise tag someone and the fact that the Chargers are going to be in a cap hell. They're going to be in cap hell next year. And one of the ways that they're going to get out of cap hell is probably cutting one of the wide receivers and one of the edges between Allen and Williams and Mack and Bosa, as we talked about. But even that move does not get them completely out of cap hell. So franchise tagging someone is probably off the table next year as a whole. You know, I do think there is kind of, before we get to the he walks solutions, like maybe a middle ground where the Chargers could meet Ekeler, right? I already talked about the high usage, but say Ekeler has more high usage on him and that body either starts to kind of break down or slow down. That's a situation where you could see maybe the Chargers and Ekeler, if, you know, Ekeler doesn't have the season that he would have wanted to have and the Chargers still haven't seen enough out of Spiller and Kelly, where it probably wouldn't be crazy in that scenario to re-sign Ekeler, although I think that's on the, you know, unlikelier options side too, as Ekeler wants to see what he can get out of free agency, and the Chargers probably aren't going to want to sign him to another contract, especially in the event where he balls out and becomes too expensive, or even if he regresses a little bit this year, do you really want to re-sign a 30-year-old back who just showed you some regression, right? So either way, I think a re-sign is probably pretty unlikely. He walks, you know, in 2024, but the running backs haven't taken a leap yet. And so this is a scenario where I think it kind of gets interesting. If you haven't seen enough out of Spiller and Kelly, then this really ratchets up the pressure on the organization to probably take a running back early in next year's draft. I know a lot of people have talked about next year's draft as, you know, a really great year for running backs as a whole. But, you know, in terms of using an early pick on a running back, it's not something that I would advise doing in the draft. But again, you never know what I haven't started watching 2024 running back tape. I can, you know, still barely tell you about all the guys in 2023. But, you know, that's going to be an interesting thing for the Chargers as they go forward is, again, talking about Spiller and Kelly, what happens this year. The other option, as I said, is he walks and another running back one does emerge, right? If they get the year that they want out of Isaiah Spiller, then a lot of these problems kind of fall on the back burner, right? You can let Kelly and Spiller walk. You can, you know, let Kelly and Ekeler walk, I should say, and have Spiller as your new RB1 and then build this group out around Isaiah Spiller if you get the year that you want from him, whatever the yards and receptions end up being that would indicate a positive year. Don't necessarily want to get into a total number because that can be kind of hard to distinguish. But yeah, if he does emerge as this team's RB1 going into next season, then the Chargers don't have much to worry about. But in the event that he doesn't, that's where you sort of start to get feeling a little icky about the running game. And then this brings us to a larger point about Kellen Moore. If Kellen Moore's offense is successful, he's probably not going to be back, right? He's probably going to get a head coaching job somewhere. And then you're talking about a new offensive system, a new running game again for a third straight year. That's just the business of the NFL. But hopefully Spiller does take some of that stress off the Chargers and take some of the stress off of Ekeler this year and takes the step that we want him to. But that's all for this episode of Bolt Breakdowns, folks. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments down below, what's your thoughts on Ekeler this year? Do you think he can hit some of those incentives? And what do you think the future of the Chargers running game is regarding after we see what happens with Kellen Moore and Ekeler and Spiller and everything going on in 2023. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys next time. As always, Bolt up.